give your life to Jesus, some people may accuse you of losing your mind. I mean, just think about it from an outsider's point of view. Let's say you tell a friend, hey, I've got a new job, but my boss, he's not willing to pay me just yet. He's asking me to pay him. And this job is getting me into all kinds of trouble. I'm getting into car accidents, and I've been imprisoned a couple of times, and people are mocking me and beating me up. But my boss keeps telling me, just wait. I know you're not getting paid now, but eventually, after you die, you'll see that it's all worth it. Now, what if you were telling a friend that friend might say, you know what? You've lost your mind. You are not right in the head. And that's kind of the way Paul's critics were looking at him and the way that he was living his life and the choices that he made. If you go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, he's describing the life that he had chosen to live, and he says, we are afflicted in every way, verse 8, but not crushed, perplexed, but not given to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. Same letter, chapter 11, he's listing all the things that he's gone through because he was living for Jesus. Imprisonments, beatings, stonings, shipwrecks, everything. And some people may look at the lifestyle that he had chosen for himself and say, this man is beside himself. In fact, if you look at our text, Taylor read for us just a moment ago from 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 13 shows us that that's exactly what some were saying, that Paul is beside himself, that he is out of his mind, that he's not operating the way that he ought to. And these weren't the only ones who had made that accusation against Paul. When he was on trial before Festus in Acts chapter 26, verse 24, Festus, the Roman governor, he said, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. And he's not the only one. People had the same misunderstanding about Jesus Christ. Mark chapter 3, verse 21. But those who are faithful don't care if other people think that they are crazy. They don't care because they know that this way of life is different, and they're not choosing it to be accepted necessarily by people or to get popular or for people to think that they are sane or praise them for their rationality. In fact, if you want to get exact about it, they haven't really chosen it. It kind of chose them, this way of life, because they've been controlled by the love of Christ. That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14. The love of Christ controls us. It took a hold on him, and it wouldn't let go. And so in a way, Paul really had no choice whatsoever but to live for Jesus Christ. Whether or not the world understands it, when God's love takes over them, when God's love takes over a person, as Paul says in verse 15, they no longer live for themselves, but for Him who for their sake died and was raised. And so he discusses this more thoroughly in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the verses we're going to look at this morning, verses 11 through 17, comparing and contrasting three ways of living. First, he's going to talk about living for ourselves. Then he's going to talk about living for Jesus. And then finally, living for others. Let's see where he starts in this comparing and contrasting living for ourselves. Throughout this letter, the second letter to the Corinthians, Paul is being pressured to commend himself, as he puts it. There are critics who are saying he's not a true apostle. He came along a lot later than the other ones. He needs a letter of recommendation from the apostles in Jerusalem or something to establish his credentials, and Paul keeps refusing to do what they're wanting to do. But they're locked into that way of thinking because a lot of people who live for themselves are spending all their time and all their energy commending themselves. It's what we do as a human race. And it's getting worse and worse all the time. You've heard the myth of Narcissus, the young man, really attractive young man who died pining away at his own image in a pond. Well, you know, if our smartphones were ponds, a lot of us would have drowned a long time ago because we are narcissistic, to use the phrase that came from that old story about Narcissus. We are. That little cursor blinking at the top of our social media page is just inviting us to talk about our lives, to tell everybody about our ordinary, mundane, banal lives that really isn't all that interesting. And so we can't resist the temptation, and we tell everybody all about ourselves, and then we're obsessed with going back and checking to see if we can get that dopamine rush from seeing how many likes we got or seeing if anybody made comments, and we're not happy if we don't get any comments and likes, and we're really not happy if we do. We don't know why we do it. We're just so self-absorbed. And really the best metaphor for our self-absorbed culture that we live in today is the selfie, the picture of oneself. People didn't used to do that, but now 93 million selfies are being taken every single day. The equivalent of, if you still remember these things, 2.5 million rolls of film every day. If you still remember what that is. 1,000 selfies are posted on Instagram every 10 seconds, and 75% of all pictures on Snapchat are people taking pictures of themselves to show everybody else. And we're all doing it, posting pictures of ourselves and talking about ourselves for an audience that doesn't care because they're doing the same thing. It's the world we live in, right? A self-absorbed culture that lives for itself. And you don't have to be on social media to be guilty of this kind of thing. Don't be sitting there if you say, well, I deleted my Facebook account, or I never got one in the first place. You can do this too. Self-absorption is very common, and we see it come out, manifest in all kinds of behaviors and attitudes, jealousy, envy, insecurity, feeling underappreciated, feeling like nobody loves you, worrying all the time about what other people think. What are we doing? We're constantly in this race to commend ourselves and promote ourselves. We're self-absorbed. And what we need to know is what Paul's telling us here in this text, that only God can give you the sense of self-worth that you're looking for. Only God can give that to you. As long as you continue to commend yourself, you're going to continue to feel jealous, insecure, envious, taken for granted, unnoticed. You're never going to escape that feeling. So knowing that, Paul says this in verse 11 of 2 Corinthians chapter 5. But what we are is known to God. What we are is known to God. And he goes on to say in this verse, he hopes that will become apparent, what he truly is will become apparent to the Corinthians' consciences. But if not, oh well. It doesn't bother him, because the only one he really cares about, the only opinion that really matters to him, is that of God the Father. That's who he wants to be known by. He says as much in the first epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. Listen to this. With me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Paul was concerned about one person's approval, the approval of God. Far too many people fail to live for Jesus simply because they can't get out of their own way. They're so busy trying to prove themselves or compete with their neighbors, they just don't have time to regard God's approval, the only one that really matters at all. But living for yourself is exhausting, isn't it? It never works. I mean, you try it, and you try to prove yourself, but you always feel inadequate, and there's always somebody who does it better than you, always somebody regarded as better than you. Only by finding approval from God are you going to get that kind of peace and fulfillment that you're looking for, that your heart so desperately longs for. Wouldn't you like to go through life not having to worry about what everybody else thinks? Wouldn't you like to go through life feeling the peace and security that you can have if you're looking only for the approval of God? Here's the paradox. If you only live for yourself, you're going to wind up feeling insecure. But if you live for Jesus instead of yourself, there's where you're going to find the peace and the fulfillment and the security. And so Paul, having learned this, no longer cares if people think he's crazy. He doesn't care what they're saying about his credentials. He's not busy trying to commend himself. He says, what we are is known to God, and that's enough. So let's move from that to another perspective that Paul is comparing and contrasting, living for Jesus. This is what he engages himself with. And as we said, he didn't really choose that life. He didn't choose to live for Jesus. He says the love of Christ controls us. Love had its hold on him. Love had a grip on him, and it's not going to let go. So Paul is locked in by love. It's interesting to notice that this word translated controls or constrains, constraineth in the King James Version, is the same word that Jesus used to describe the feeling of compulsion that he had on his way to the cross in Luke chapter 12, verse 50. He says, I have a baptism to be baptized with. And the baptism he's talking about there is not water baptism. Jesus has already been baptized by John in the Jordan River. He's talking about a different kind of overwhelming submersion, a submersion in suffering. And he says, how great is my distress until it is accomplished. And the word distress there is the same word that Paul uses in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14, to talk about what love was doing to him. Jesus felt compelled to go to Calvary and die for us. And it was a great compulsion that wasn't going to be satisfied until he accomplished the work that he'd been given to do. And Paul says, the love of Christ is doing this for me. It's forcing me. It's compelling me. What does he mean by love of Christ? There are two ways that can be taken. One could be my love for Jesus Christ. But the other sense could be Jesus' love for me. And the context seems to suggest that Paul is talking about the latter sense. He's talking about Jesus' love for me is what is controlling me and pushing me into these directions that seem irrational and crazy to other people, that make them say he's beside himself. When Christ's love, when it's really known and it's fully appreciated and accepted, changes your whole outlook on life. Paul has been talking about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, starting all the way back in verse 7, with that verse that we know so well, we walk by faith, not by sight. Paul didn't follow his eyes or what everybody was telling him or the apparent situation. He followed his faith. And that's what guided him, how he went from one place to the other, how he chose his direction. And so a few verses later in the same chapter, verse 17 of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he says, we are a new creation. A new creation means a new set of eyes, a new perspective, seeing things in a totally different way. And so the great change that occurred with Paul at his conversion wasn't behavior modification, okay? It wasn't Paul saying, I've lived that way long enough. The rabbis have been telling me to change. The preachers have been telling me to change. My parents have been telling me to change. The church is telling me to change. God is telling me to change. And so I just need to get a hold of myself and exercise a lot of willpower here and finally do what I know that I've needed to do for a long time. I know that's how we try to change in our lives, very unsuccessfully, but that's not what happened with Paul. You see, what happened with Paul is he got a whole new outlook on life. And it's the fresh perspective that changed his behavior. he saw the love of Christ for the first time and understood it and finally accepted it. And that's what changed his perspective. Now, what's the perspective? He gives 3 perspectives here to tell us why he's now living for Jesus instead of living for himself. And to get a little technical here, it won't be too technical if you have your Bibles open and you're looking at this as we're studying it together. But to get a little technical, these 3 perspectives are introduced by 2 participles in the language that's used here that are in a particular tense that has to do with an action that occurred or an event that occurred at a specific time in the past. Okay, so these 2 participles are going to point back to a certain point in Paul's life, which obviously is his conversion to Jesus Christ. The moment on the Damascus Road, but not just that, the point at which Ananias came to his house and said, "Why do you wait? Rise and be baptized, calling on the name of the Lord." Acts 22, verse 16. That point, that's what he's talking about with these 2 participles, and they introduce the new perspective given in 3 ways that you can see here in the text. So here it goes. Here's the first one. In verse 14, introduced by the participle translated concluded. We have concluded. In the English Standard Version, it can mean judged, it can mean become convinced of, but he introduces with that participle 2 perspectives, and the first one is this, verse 14, that one has died for all, therefore all died. He became convinced, first of all, of this new perspective. The scales literally fell from his eyes. You know, Paul had been blind. When Ananias came, the scales fell from his eyes, and he became convinced, number 1, of this new perspective, that Jesus died for all, and so all have died. In other words, he died the death that sinners deserve. And it was an effective death. He didn't just die and say, "I'm doing this." When he died, it actually was a sufficient death for sinners. That's the first perspective. Now, under that same participle, concluded, here's the second thing that came to him upon his conversion. The second thing is, he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. Which means that for all who through faith come to Christ, the old life of sin is replaced by a new life with Jesus Christ. That you can't just see that sacrifice and understand it and receive it through faith and obedience to the gospel and then go back to living the way that you've always lived. You see, he came to this realization that Christ is making me into a new creation. So I'm not the same person anymore that I used to be. Now, there's 3 perspectives, and the third one is introduced by another participle, still in the same tense that points back to something that happened before. And this is in verse 16, translated regarded. He says, "From now on, I regarded Christ differently." He says, I regarded that, I knew that, I evaluated that. I no longer look at Jesus according to the flesh. That is, according to the outward appearance. When this fresh perspective came upon him that came from the love of Christ, he stopped looking at Jesus, some renegade prophet that came from Nazareth. That's the way he looked at him when he was persecuting Christians, but all of a sudden he saw things from the spiritual realities. And not just Jesus' identity, that's what he names here, but not just that. Everything now he saw through a spiritual lens. And that lens was provided to him by the love of Christ. So here's how all of this works. Paul didn't choose to live for Jesus. He's controlled by the love of Christ on the cross to live for Jesus. And the way that control works is the love of Christ gave him a fresh perspective. It told him that when Christ died, he died for all. It told him that because Christ died, he could no longer live for himself. He had to live for Jesus. And it also taught him that he was in a new situation now where he saw things from a spiritual perspective instead of a physical perspective. That's what living for Jesus means. Now, what does it mean to live for others? And how does that fit into this picture of living for Jesus? Basically this: your service to Christ serves others. Your service for Christ serves others. It's impossible to serve Jesus and not serve others at the same time, because Jesus was constantly calling on His disciples to serve one another. That's the new commandment that He gave, according to John chapter 13, verse 34 and 35. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I've loved you, that you also love one another. He says, by this shall all people know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Now, how do you follow this Jesus who's commanding you to do that, who's saying this is the new commandment? How do you do that and not serve others? Your service for Christ serves others. Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan. What is that all about? Loving your neighbor. And neighbor means everybody. You can't be the man who's too busy to stop and help somebody who's truly in need. You can't be that person anymore in Christ. But the love of Christ says, no, stop what you're doing. Do what you can to help that person, even at the point of self-sacrifice. Your service for Christ serves others. In Paul's case, what was it? Well, we have to understand he's not talking about all of his service here. He's just talking about a particular context, and in this context, he describes how he's serving others, living for others, in two words. The first one's in verse 11, where he says, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade others. So he's persuading others. And the second term is in verse 20 of 2 Corinthians 5, where he says, God making His appeal through us, we implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. So through knowing the fear of the Lord, he was persuading people, and he was also imploring people to be reconciled to Jesus Christ. That's what he was doing in this context, to live for others. Now, of course, he was doing a lot of other things as well. We see him doing all kinds of things through the New Testament to show love to others. But here, it was through his persuasion and imploring that he was giving in his preaching. That's what Paul was doing. And that's not all that he was doing. But the what of his service here is not as important as the how. It's not about the what, it's about the how. And the how is this: living for Jesus is not just a competition to try to show how smart you are, how much more you know about the Bible than other people, or winning arguments against other people regarding religion and Jesus Christ. And although it's absolutely necessary, it's also not regarded as an obligation. Living for Christ is not about, just doing what I have to do because God's making me do this. That's not it either. Paul was controlled by the love of Christ. And so living for Jesus is about being controlled by love. As he writes in another place in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, through love, serve one another. It's not about the what here, that he's persuading people or imploring people, but it's how he's doing that. He could do that through hatred, right? A lot of people have persuaded others to do things out of hatred, out of selfish ambition, through force, domineering them. But this is persuasion from love, speaking the truth in love. And that's what was going on. Jesus' sacrifice was so powerful, it motivated him to do more for others than wealth could, or accolades, or desire for power. If we can really allow the cross to penetrate our hearts, our gratitude for Jesus and His redemptive work that He did on the cross is all the fuel that we need for our service. Now, when your service is rendered on behalf of the Lord, you don't care who gets the credit, because His approval is all the approval that you really care about, all the approval that you need. But think about the advice that Paul gave to servants in Colossians chapter 3, verse 23. These servants weren't getting anything they weren't even getting paid for the work that they were doing. And Paul says, whatever you do, he says, do it for the Lord and not for men. In other words, Look for the approval that God gives, not for the approval that man gives. That's not what's important. The Jewish rabbis used to tell this story about a rabbi who slept and had a dream, and in the dream, God came to him and he said, your place in paradise is going to be next to Nathan the butcher. And he awoke troubled by this and very upset because he was a very well-respected rabbi. This man, Rabbi Josiah, was respected in all the villages that he visited, and he expected to have some place that was more prominent than next to Nathan the butcher. So he decided that he would go visit the butcher to find out what made him so special to deserve a seat next to the rabbi in paradise. And he came to the village where he was and began inquiring about him and telling the story. And the villagers said, why do you want to see this Nathan the butcher? He's not anybody of any importance. And he said, well, just go find him and tell him to come see me. I need to talk to him. I must talk to him. So they find him, and the butcher says, I'm not going to see him. I don't have anything to tell him. There's nothing special about my life. I wouldn't dare go to bother Rabbi Josiah. So he doesn't go. And the rabbi's so vexed by this problem, he decides, I've got to go see him myself. So he finds out where the butcher lives, and he knocks on his door, and Nathan the butcher opens his door, and he's shocked and embarrassed. Why have you come to my house? I'm nothing. He said, there must be something. I had this dream that said that in paradise, I'm supposed to sit next to you. What is it that you've done that's so great in service? And the butcher said this. He said, I've not rendered any service that's special to the Lord. I can't preach. I'm not an intellectual. I don't have the time to study. I don't even have time to go out and serve others because I spend all of my time helping my weak and infirm mother and father. And whenever he said that, the rabbi realized in that moment that that was it. It was his humble service that he didn't regard as anything, that God was approving, and the reason why he was sitting next to the rabbi in paradise. And of course, that's a fairy tale, but it's a story that I think of sometimes when I talk to some of our older members who can't do what they used to do, and they'll feel guilty, and they'll say, you know, I wish that I could serve more. I used to do so much for the Lord. I used to be so active. I used to come to all the services, and I just can't get out anymore, and I just can't do like I used to do. And what they need to understand is that you're only working to serve God. His approval is all that you need, and He knows your limits. And He knows your heart. And He knows that you're doing all that you can do. And it may be that your faithfulness now is the greatest service you've ever rendered in God's eyes. Maybe the world doesn't see it that way. Who cares what the world thinks? How many times has the world been wrong? God is never wrong. God is never wrong. We live for Him and not for anyone else. Now, there's a song, I'll Live for Him. And it goes like this. My life, my love, I give to Thee, Thou Lamb of God who died for me. Oh, may I ever faithful be, my Savior and my God. I'll live for Him who died for me. How happy then my life shall be. I'll live for Him who died for me, my Savior and my God. Do you live for Jesus? You know His love. You know that love on the cross. Has it taken hold of you, controlling you, changing your perspective so that you see things in a totally different way, no longer commending yourself and fighting for others' approval, but working only for the approval of God? Is that enough for you? Do you realize you'll never get any peace or satisfaction or fulfillment any other way? Only God can give you that kind of peace that you need. Is the love of Christ, has it taken hold of you? And if there's something that needs to change today, are you ready to change it? Will that love bring you to the moment of new obedience? If you're ready, we're going to sing an invitation song. If there's anything that we can do to help you this morning, please come now, right now, as we stand and as we sing.